Tuesday, August 25th, 2026. Welcome back. And today we're talking about the Atlantic hurricane season because after 2 months of near total silence, a season that meteorologists have been calling one of the slowest starts in nearly 40 years is suddenly showing real signs of waking up right as it enters what is historically the most dangerous stretch of the entire year. If you spent this summer thinking the 2026 hurricane season was a non-event, you are not wrong, and you are also about to be surprised. Because the National Hurricane Center is right now watching not one but two separate areas of the Atlantic that could develop into the season's next named storms within days, and they're doing it at the exact moment the calendar shifts into the period when the Atlantic Basin historically produces its most dangerous and most destructive hurricanes. This video is about why the season went quiet in the first place, why it's stirring now, what's actually out there in the ocean right now that forecasters are tracking, why a slow start to hurricane season has never, in the entire historical record, meant a safe season, and what a sudden late season surge could realistically look like if this pattern continues to build. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what's brewing in the Atlantic right now, why the timing of this awakening matters so much, and what you need to know if you live anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the Eastern Seaboard. Let's start with just how unusual this season has actually been up to this point, because the numbers here are genuinely striking. As of today, we are on day 85 of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, and the entire basin has produced only 3 named storms all year, with a cumulative accumulated cyclone energy value, the metric meteorologists use to measure the total combined strength and duration of a season's storms, sitting at just 3. To put that in perspective, the average date for the 4th named storm of an Atlantic season to form is August 15th, meaning as of today, the season is already more than a week behind that average pace for naming its 4th storm, and it hasn't even produced its first hurricane yet, despite the average date for the season's first hurricane falling on August 11th. Meteorologists tracking this season have explicitly described it as the slowest start to Atlantic hurricane activity in almost 40 years, when measured by overall tropical activity across the entire basin. This isn't a subjective impression. It's a measurable, historically significant lull, and it has left forecasters, coastal residents, and emergency planners across the Gulf Coast and Eastern Seaboard with a season that has, so far, largely failed to live up to the kind of activity the basin typically produces by the time August draws to a close. So why has this season been so unusually quiet? The answer comes down almost entirely to 2 factors working together, and understanding them helps explain both why the season has been dead calm and why that calm might be ending right now. The first factor is El Niño. Colorado State University's seasonal hurricane forecasting team, one of the most respected and closely watched sources for Atlantic hurricane predictions, has been forecasting a below-normal season since their initial outlook back in April, specifically because of an expected transition from weak La Niña conditions into a moderate to strong El Niño pattern developing across the tropical Pacific. That forecast has held up and, if anything, has been reinforced as the season has progressed. In their most recent update, released in early August, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration doubled down on its call for a quieter than average season, actually lowering both the total number of named storms and major hurricanes expected for the remainder of the year compared to their initial forecast back in the spring, explicitly citing what one meteorological outlet described as a record-breaking El Niño as the primary driver behind that downward revision. El Niño matters enormously for Atlantic hurricane activity because of how it affects the upper atmosphere over the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. During El Niño years, wind shear, meaning the change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes above the ocean surface, tends to increase significantly across the Atlantic basin, and strong wind shear is one of the most effective natural forces for tearing apart a developing tropical system before it ever has the chance to organize into a hurricane. Colorado State's most recent forecast update explicitly states that they anticipate El Niño being the dominant factor, driving increased levels of tropical Atlantic vertical wind shear this season, and that they're forecasting a below-average probability for major hurricane landfalls along the continental United States coastline and across the Caribbean as a direct result. The second factor working against storm development this summer has been the presence of dry, dusty air streaming off the Sahara Desert, combined with that same persistent wind shear, creating what meteorologists have been describing throughout the season as a kind of 1-2 punch against tropical development. Weather Trader's daily tropics coverage, tracking the Atlantic basin in real time, has repeatedly noted throughout the past several weeks that tropical waves emerging off the African coast have looked healthy and promising on satellite imagery, only to encounter dry Saharan air layers, dust, and vertical wind shear that cause them to lose organization and fizzle out before they can strengthen into anything significant. This pattern has repeated itself over and over across the basin this summer, wave after wave showing initial promise and then falling apart, which is precisely why the season's accumulated cyclone energy has remained so far below where it would typically sit at this point in a normal year. Colorado State's own seasonal outlook projects. Atlantic Basin accumulated cyclone energy for the full 2026 season to land at roughly 75% of the long-term average, a figure that, while representing a genuinely quieter than normal year overall, still translates into a meaningful amount of additional tropical activity yet to come before the season concludes. Now here's where the story turns, because this same quiet season is, as of right now, showing genuine signs of stirring. And it's happening at almost exactly the moment the Atlantic hurricane season historically becomes most dangerous. The National Hurricane Center is currently monitoring 2 separate disturbances in the Atlantic Basin, and forecasters are watching both closely for signs of development in the days immediately ahead. The first system, designated Invest 95L, is a sustained area of convection sitting in the central subtropical Atlantic, currently located a few hundred miles southeast of Bermuda. As of today, the system has been assigned a medium chance of development, with forecasters estimating roughly a 50% probability that it organizes into the season's next named storm, which would take the name Dolly, the next name on this year's Atlantic storm list. However, meteorologists tracking this specific system have cautioned that it remains poorly organized and that strong jet stream winds are likely to rip it apart within the next day or two, whisking whatever weather remains of it toward Atlantic Canada by the middle of this week. Forecasters have drawn a direct comparison to Cristobal, the most recent named storm of this season, which similarly formed in the subtropics around the middle of a month and failed to survive long enough to meaningfully add to the season's overall activity. In other words, Invest 95L may very well become a short-lived, relatively minor storm that spins up briefly and then dissolves without ever threatening land, following the same pattern that has defined so much of this unusually quiet season. But the second system being watched right now is a genuinely different story, and it's the one meteorologists are paying much closer attention to. Later this week, a strong tropical wave is expected to roll westward out of Africa and into the main development region of the deep tropics, the stretch of ocean between the west coast of Africa and the Caribbean that historically produces the Atlantic's most powerful and most dangerous hurricanes. This tropical wave has already been assigned an initial designation, Invest 96L, and as of today, forecasters are placing its odds of development at around 60% over the next 7 days, with an expected track running west-northwest, directly toward the wider Caribbean and Atlantic basin. This is meaningfully different from Invest 95L, both in its location and in its potential trajectory. Storms that develop out of tropical waves moving off the African coast into the main development region have historically been responsible for some of the most significant and most destructive hurricanes in Atlantic history, precisely because that stretch of open warm ocean gives a developing system days of uninterrupted time and favorable conditions to organize and strengthen before it ever approaches land. As of today's tropical outlook from weather.com, the National Hurricane Center has specifically highlighted both of these areas, one in the central Atlantic east of Bermuda, and one in the eastern Atlantic associated with the incoming tropical wave, as regions to watch closely this week as the Atlantic Basin heads into what is typically the busiest stretch of the entire hurricane season. This timing is genuinely critical to understand. It's the core reason this story deserves real attention rather than a passing glance. The Atlantic hurricane season runs officially from June 1st through November 30th, but activity within that 6-month window is anything but evenly distributed. The overwhelming majority of the season's most powerful and most destructive storms form during a relatively narrow window, stretching from mid-August through mid-October, a period climatologists often refer to as the peak of the season, when ocean temperatures across the tropical Atlantic have had the entire summer to warm to their highest levels, and when the broader atmospheric conditions across the basin are most consistently favorable for storm formation and intensification. We are right now on August 24th, standing directly at the entrance to that peak window. A season that has been unusually quiet through June, July, and the first 3 weeks of August isn't necessarily a season that will remain quiet through September and October, precisely because the climatological engine driving Atlantic hurricane formation is only now reaching its most powerful phase of the year, regardless of how sluggish the preceding 2.5 months happen to be. This is exactly why meteorologists covering the tropics have specifically framed this week's developments as a potential late August awakening for a season that has, up to this point, largely failed to fire. And it's worth being very clear about what that awakening could actually mean, because even a below-normal season by Colorado State University's own most recent forecast is still expected to produce 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes before the season concludes at the end of November, figures that, while below the 1991 to 2020 average of roughly 14 named storms and 7 hurricanes, are still very much a full active hurricane season by any reasonable standard. A quiet start through the first 85 days of the season does not change the fact that this year's forecast still calls for more than a dozen additional named storms and multiple hurricanes to form before the season is over, the overwhelming majority of them still ahead of us rather than behind us. It's also worth understanding why a slow start to hurricane season has never been a reliable indicator of a safe season overall, because this is one of the most persistent and most dangerous misconceptions in how the public tends to think about hurricane risk. Team Rubicon, the disaster response organization that regularly issues hurricane preparedness guidance, has been explicit about this exact point in their coverage of the 2026 season, noting directly that forecasts change and seasons surprise, and that coastal residents, especially those in the south and along the eastern seaboard, need to take hurricane preparedness seriously every single season, regardless of what the seasonal forecasts say, because it only takes one storm making landfall in the wrong place to turn even a below-average season into a genuine disaster for the specific community it strikes. Colorado State University's own forecasting team echoes this same warning in nearly identical language, stating plainly that, as with all hurricane seasons, coastal residents are reminded that it only takes one hurricane making landfall to make it an active season for them personally, and that thorough preparations should be made every season, regardless of how much overall activity has been predicted for the basin as a whole. This isn't just cautious hedging from forecasters covering themselves. It reflects genuine historical reality. Some of the most destructive hurricanes in American history have formed during seasons that were, up to that point, running quiet or below average overall. A season's total named storm count and its accumulated cyclone energy value tell you something meaningful about the basin's overall activity level, but they tell you almost nothing about whether any single one of those storms will happen to track directly toward a major population center at exactly the wrong moment. Hurricane risk isn't really about how many storms form in a given year. It's about where those storms go, and a quiet season that produces only a handful of storms can still be a devastating one if even a single storm out of that small handful makes landfall in the wrong place. This is also a good moment to talk about a phenomenon that has become an increasingly central part of how meteorologists think about hurricane danger in recent years, rapid intensification, because it's directly relevant to why a system like Invest 96L, currently just an unremarkable tropical wave rolling off the African coast, deserves genuine attention rather than dismissal. Rapid intensification is formally defined as an increase in a tropical cyclone's maximum sustained winds of at least 30 knots, roughly 35 miles per hour, within a single 24-hour period. Some storms intensify even more dramatically than that baseline threshold, undergoing what's classified as extreme rapid intensification, an increase of at least 50 knots, approximately 58 miles per hour, within that same 24-hour window. According to Climate Central's ongoing tracking of Atlantic tropical cyclone behavior from 1980 through 2025, a total of 190 Atlantic tropical cyclones underwent rapid intensification, and nearly a quarter of those storms, 46 out of the 190, experienced that more extreme rate of intensification. Just last year in 2025, 4 separate Atlantic hurricanes, Erin, Gabrielle, Humberto, and Melissa, all underwent rapid intensification. And 3 of those storms, Erin, Humberto, and Melissa, went on to reach Category 5 intensity, the strongest possible classification on the Saffir-Simpson wind scale. Rapid intensification is precisely why hurricane forecasting remains genuinely difficult even with the sophisticated modeling tools available today. And it's precisely why an early-stage tropical wave that looks unremarkable on today's satellite imagery cannot simply be dismissed as harmless. Researchers studying this phenomenon have noted that forecasting rapid intensification remains one of the most persistent challenges in hurricane science, and that difficulty directly contributes to the outsized human and economic toll these storms tend to produce, precisely because rapid intensification events often catch coastal communities without enough time to fully prepare. Hurricane Michael, when it first became a tropical storm in the Gulf of Mexico, was expected by forecasters to top out at no more than 70 miles per hour. It went on to make landfall as a devastating major hurricane, having rapidly intensified far beyond what the initial forecast had anticipated. Hurricane Helene needed just 2 days to grow from a relatively weak tropical storm into a major Category 4 hurricane by the time it reached the Florida coastline, a transformation blamed for approximately 250 deaths across several southern states. Hurricane Harvey rapidly intensified as it approached the Texas coast, ultimately submerging parts of the Houston metropolitan area under unprecedented rainfall and causing an estimated $160 billion in damage. The reason rapid intensification has become an increasingly prominent part of hurricane science and hurricane risk communication comes down to warmer ocean temperatures. Warmer waters provide more of the fundamental fuel that tropical cyclones need to intensify, and research has increasingly suggested that warmer oceans may be contributing to a larger overall fraction of tropical cyclones undergoing this kind of rapid strengthening. This is exactly why researchers at institutions like the National Center for Atmospheric Research have been working specifically on methods to predict rapid intensification further in advance, developing techniques that analyze a storm's most likely forecasted tracks to identify which paths carry a significantly higher probability of triggering rapid intensification compared to others, giving forecasters more advanced confidence about when a storm is most likely to undergo this kind of sudden, dangerous strengthening. Researchers involved in this work have described their goal in fairly direct terms, aiming to give forecasters enough information that they can have real confidence days in advance about when a hurricane is most likely to intensify rapidly, rather than being caught off guard the way earlier generations of forecasters so often were with storms like Michael and Harvey. Bringing this back to the current situation in the Atlantic, this is precisely why the tropical wave set to emerge off the African coast later this week, Invest 96L, deserves real attention despite currently being nothing more than an unremarkable disturbance on today's satellite imagery. Systems that form in the main development region and track westward across the warm waters of the tropical Atlantic and Caribbean have historically been the storms most capable of undergoing exactly this kind of rapid, sometimes extreme intensification as they approach land, precisely because that stretch of ocean provides the warm water and generally lower wind shear conditions that fuel this kind of rapid strengthening. A system that looks modest and disorganized today can, under the right conditions, become something considerably more dangerous within a matter of days, which is exactly why meteorologists never treat an early-stage tropical wave as something to simply ignore, even during a season that has otherwise been historically quiet. Sea surface temperatures across the Atlantic basin remain notably warm heading into this critical stretch, with readings near 28 degrees Celsius across large sections of the basin, well above the threshold generally considered necessary to sustain and strengthen a developing tropical system, meaning the fuel for a genuine intensification event remains readily available even after a summer defined mostly by wind shear and dry air keeping that fuel from being used. It's also worth understanding what's happening elsewhere across the broader Pacific Basin right now, because it underscores just how much active tropical weather is actually occurring globally at this exact moment, even if the Atlantic specifically has been unusually subdued. As of today, the National Hurricane Center is simultaneously issuing advisories for Tropical Storm Isel in the eastern Pacific, which forecasters expect could strengthen into a hurricane later today, though it's expected to remain safely away from any land areas during that period of strengthening. In the central Pacific, the agency is tracking both Tropical Storm Lala and Tropical Depression Moke, with Moke having passed roughly 250 miles safely south of Hawaii's Big Island over this past weekend as a borderline tropical storm, bringing under 2 to 3 inches of rainfall to the island without causing the kind of widespread flooding that a more direct or more powerful hit might have produced, though a flood watch has remained in effect for lingering rains over already saturated ground on the island's east-facing slopes. Meanwhile, in the western Pacific, Typhoon Sodell remains at major intensity with sustained winds near 100 knots, though dry air has begun eroding its convective structure, leaving what forecasters describe as a ragged eye as the storm's organization weakens somewhat. Taken together, this global picture shows a genuinely active period of tropical activity across multiple ocean basins simultaneously, even as the Atlantic specifically has lagged well behind its usual seasonal pace up to this point, a reminder that the relative quiet in one basin doesn't reflect a quiet planet overall, simply a quiet stretch in one specific and, as of this week, increasingly restless corner of it. So what does all of this actually mean if you live along the Gulf Coast, the eastern seaboard, or anywhere else within reach of the Atlantic Basin's hurricane track? First, and most importantly, a quiet first 85 days of hurricane season is not a reason to let your guard down as the calendar moves into the period when the season's most dangerous storms have historically formed. The two systems currently being tracked by the National Hurricane Center, the disturbance near Bermuda and the incoming tropical wave off the African coast, represent exactly the kind of activity meteorologists expect to see increase as the season transitions into its climatological peak. And even a season forecast to run below normal overall is still expected to produce well over a dozen more named storms and several more hurricanes before the season concludes at the end of November. Second, understand that the specific danger posed by any individual storm has very little to do with how quiet or how active the overall season has been up to that point, and everything to do with where that storm ultimately tracks and how much it manages to strengthen before making landfall, which is precisely why phenomena like rapid intensification make individual storm forecasts genuinely difficult to predict with full confidence even days in advance. If you live in a hurricane-prone region, now is exactly the right moment to make sure your preparations are actually in order, rather than waiting until a storm is already bearing down on the coastline with only a few days of advance warning. Have an evacuation plan established for your household, and know your specific evacuation zone if you live along the coast. since evacuation orders are typically issued by zone rather than as a single blanket order for an entire region. Keep a hurricane emergency kit stocked and ready, including water, non-perishable food, medications, a battery-powered or hand-crank radio, flashlights, and copies of essential documents, sufficient to sustain your household for at least 72 hours without outside assistance. If you live in a location prone to storm surge or significant flooding, understand your specific flood risk ahead of time, since storm surge, rather than wind, has historically been responsible for the majority of hurricane-related fatalities in the United States. Review your homeowner's or renter's insurance policy now, before a storm is actually approaching, to understand exactly what is and isn't covered, particularly regarding flood damage, which typically requires separate flood insurance rather than being covered under a standard homeowner's policy. And stay closely tuned to updates from the National Hurricane Center and your local National Weather Service office over the coming days and weeks, since both of the systems currently being tracked remain genuinely uncertain in their eventual development and track. And that uncertainty is exactly the kind of situation where staying informed in real time matters most. None of this is about generating panic over what remains, even today, a pair of disturbances rather than confirmed developing hurricanes. The system near Bermuda may well dissolve within days, exactly as forecasters currently expect, following the same pattern that Cristobal and so many other short-lived systems have followed throughout this unusually quiet season. The tropical wave set to emerge from Africa later this week may also fail to organize, falling victim to the same combination of dry air and wind shear that has torn apart wave after wave across the Atlantic this summer. But the broader point here isn't about any single system, it's about the timing. We are entering the single most dangerous stretch of the Atlantic hurricane season, the period historically responsible for the overwhelming majority of the basin's most powerful and most destructive storms. And after 2.5 months of unusual quiet, the Atlantic is showing its first genuine signs of stirring right as that dangerous window opens. That combination, historically quiet season plus historically dangerous timing, plus genuine current activity being tracked by the National Hurricane Center, is exactly the kind of setup that deserves real attention rather than the kind of complacency that an unusually calm summer might otherwise encourage. If breakdowns like this one, connecting the science of why a season went quiet with the real current activity that could define how it actually ends, are useful to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, because staying ahead of hurricane season, rather than reacting to it once a storm is already approaching, is exactly the kind of preparation that genuinely protects lives and property. Leave a comment with your thoughts below, especially if you live along the Gulf Coast or the Eastern Seaboard and have your own hurricane preparedness routine you'd like to share, because that kind of practical first-hand experience genuinely helps other people watching this get ready as well. And if you know anyone living in a hurricane-prone area who has been lulled into a false sense of security by this summer's quiet stretch, share this with them, because a season that has been slow for 85 days can still turn dangerous in a matter of days once conditions across the basin finally align, exactly as they appear to be aligning right now. The Atlantic has been quiet for most of this year, but quiet seasons don't stay quiet forever, and this one may be about to prove exactly that, right as it enters the months that matter most. Stay informed, stay prepared, and stay with us as we continue tracking these systems in the days ahead.